The wrench slipped from Paul Rourke's hand and clattered against the concrete floor of his auto shop. He glanced at the clock mounted above the tool bench. 3:47. Scott's preschool let out at 4. Paul wiped his palms on the front of his coveralls, the fabric stiff with dried grease and the smell of motor oil that had become as familiar to him as his own skin. He'd spent the last hour replacing a timing belt on a Honda Accord, his hands moving with the practiced efficiency of a man who understood machines better than he understood most people. "Heading out, boss?" Tommy called from beneath a lifted Chevy truck, his voice echoing in the bay. "Yeah, gotta pick up Scott." Paul stripped off his coveralls and hung them on the hook by his office door. He pulled on a clean flannel shirt over his t-shirt, though he knew the scent of the shop would cling to him regardless. It always did. The drive to Little Pines Preschool took 12 minutes through the winding roads of Evergreen Hollow, Colorado. The town pressed against the foothills like something that had grown there naturally. Modest brick buildings, residential streets lined with pines and aspens, the kind of place where people knew your name at the grocery store. Paul had lived here his entire life. He'd inherited the auto shop from his father, built a marriage in the small church on Maple Street, bought a house 3 blocks from where he'd grown up. The familiarity of it all used to comfort him. Lately, it felt more like a cage. Paul pulled into the preschool parking lot and cut the engine. Through the windshield, he could see other parents already gathering at the entrance, chatting with one another while children spilled out through the double doors in bursts of color and noise. He recognized most of them. Jeff Morrison, who owned the hardware store, Andrea Walsh from the library, Tom Chun, who managed the grocery store on 3rd Avenue. He climbed out of his truck and headed toward the building. The October air carried the bite of approaching winter, and the trees surrounding the parking lot had begun to turn, their leaves shifting to amber and rust. Paul shoved his hands into his jacket pockets and walked through the front doors. The interior of Little Pines smelled like tempera paint and graham crackers. Construction paper covered the walls, handprints shaped into turkeys, crayon drawings of families, alphabet letters decorated with glitter. Paul had always found something peaceful about this place, something that made the chaos of the outside world feel distant and manageable. Ms. Laurel stood near the sign-out desk, her silver hair pulled back in its usual bun. She looked up when Paul approached, and he saw her expression shift, a smile that started warm and then faltered, her eyes widening slightly. "Mr. Rourke," she said, and there was something in her voice that made Paul step slow. "Everything okay?" Paul asked. His pulse kicked up a notch, the way it did when he sensed something wrong with an engine before he could identify the specific problem. Ms. Laurel's hands fidgeted with the clipboard she held. She glanced toward her colleague at the craft table, then back at Paul. "Your brother picked Scott up earlier. About 45 minutes ago." The words landed like a physical thing. Paul felt them hit his chest, felt the air in the room change temperature. He kept his face steady, his voice level. "What did you say?" "Your brother." Ms. Laurel's smile had vanished entirely now. "He said you called ahead. He had Scott's name, knew his teacher, knew what cubby." "I don't have a brother." The color drained from Ms. Laurel's face. The clipboard slipped from her fingers and hit the floor with a crack that made several children look over. Paul saw the moment understanding struck her, saw her hand rise to her mouth. "Oh God," she whispered. "Oh my God." Paul's mind worked through the information with mechanical precision, even as his heart hammered against his ribs. He needed to stay calm. Panic wouldn't help Scott. Anger wouldn't help Scott. He needed to think clearly, move efficiently, understand exactly what had happened. "What did he look like?" Paul's voice came out steady, almost conversational. "This man who took my son." Ms. Laurel was already moving toward the desk phone, her hands shaking. "I need to call the police." "I need to. Answer my question first." Paul stepped closer, and his tone cut through her panic. Not loud, not aggressive, but absolutely firm. "What did he look like?" "Tall, dark hair, maybe mid-30s. He was..." She pressed her palm against her forehead, trying to recall. "He was wearing a black jacket. Nice watch. He smiled a lot. Did Scott seem scared?" Ms. Laurel hesitated, and that hesitation told Paul something crucial. "No. He went with him willingly." Paul felt something cold settle in his stomach. Scott knew this man. His 4-year-old son had recognized whoever had taken him, had felt comfortable enough to leave with him. The implications of that fact spread through Paul's thoughts like cracks in ice. Ms. Laurel was dialing 911 now, her voice high and trembling as she explained the situation to the dispatcher. Paul pulled out his own phone and stared at the screen. He should call Cheryl, his wife, Scott's mother. She needed to know. His thumb hovered over her contact, and he felt that familiar resistance, that weight that had settled between them over the past year. They barely spoke anymore except about Scott, logistics and schedules, and what needed to be picked up from the store. She worked late most nights. She spent hours on her phone. She looked at him like he was furniture, something functional but unremarkable. Paul pressed the call button. The phone rang 4 times before Cheryl answered. "Hey," she said, and her voice carried that distracted quality it always had now, like she was only halfway paying attention. "Scott's missing," Paul said. Silence. "Then what?" "Someone picked him up for preschool. A man. The teachers thought he was my brother." Paul kept his voice measured, watching Ms. Laurel pace near the desk while she spoke to the police. "I'm at Little Pines now. They're calling it in." "What do you mean someone picked him up?" Cheryl's voice climbed higher. "He should be there. He should be with you right now." Something about her tone struck Paul as off. Not the panic, that made sense. But there was something else underneath it, something that sounded almost like preparation, like she'd practiced this response. "Do you know who would have done this?" Paul asked. "How would I know?" The words came too fast. "You're there. You should have been on time. If you'd been on time." "I was on time," Paul interrupted. "He was gone before I got here." He heard her breathing on the other end of the line, heard background noise that might have been traffic or wind or something else. "Where's she right now?" She'd said she had a work meeting this afternoon, something at a client's office across town. "I'm leaving now," Cheryl said. "I'll be there in 15 minutes. The line went dead. Paul lowered the phone and looked at Ms. Laurel, who had finished her call and now stood with her arms wrapped around herself. 2 other teachers had gathered nearby, their faces pale. "The police are on their way," Ms. Laurel said. "Mr. Rourke, I am so sorry. I thought he knew everything about Scott. He said you'd called ahead, that there was a family emergency." "Show me the security footage," Paul said. The police said to wait. "Show me now." Ms. Laurel nodded and led him to the small office behind the front desk. The computer screen showed 4 different camera angles from around the building. She clicked through to the afternoon footage and scrubbed backward until she found the timestamp. 3:15. Paul watched the screen. The man appeared in the parking lot camera first, walking toward the building with his hands in his pockets. Ms. Laurel was right, tall, dark-haired, mid-30s, black jacket. He moved with confidence, like he belonged there. Paul's eyes traced every detail, committing them to memory. The interior camera showed the man entering, approaching the desk, speaking with Ms. Laurel. His body language was casual, friendly. He laughed at something she said. Then Scott appeared in frame, his small backpack bouncing on his shoulders as he ran toward the man. Paul's jaw tightened. Scott wasn't scared. He knew this person. He went to him naturally, even reached up to take his hand. The man bent down, said something to Scott that made the boy smile, then let him out the door. The whole interaction lasted less than 3 minutes. "Can you go back?" Paul said, to his face. Ms. Laurel rewound the footage and paused on the clearest shot of the man's face. Paul stared at it, his mind rifling through every person he'd encountered over the past year. And then recognition clicked into place. He knew this man. Not well, but he'd seen him before. At the gym where Cheryl had started going 6 months ago. Paul had stopped by once to give her the keys she'd forgotten, and this man had been there, standing too close to her by the weight rack, making her laugh in a way Paul hadn't seen in years. Cole. That was his name. Cole something. Cheryl had introduced them briefly, dismissively, said he was just someone who went to the same gym, offered fitness advice sometimes. Paul's hands curled into fists at his sides. The sound of sirens cut through the air outside. Blue and red lights washed across the parking lot as 2 police cruisers pulled up. Paul straightened, rolled his shoulders back, and walked out to meet them. Detective Holt arrived 10 minutes later, a broad-shouldered man in his 50s with gray threading through his dark hair. He listened to Ms. Laurel's explanation, took notes in a small leather notebook, then turned his attention to Paul. "Mr. Rourke," Holt said, "I need you to tell me everything you know about who might have taken your son." They sat in the preschool office, the space cramped with Holt, another officer named Bennett, and Ms. Laurel. Paul kept his posture straight, his hands resting calmly on his knees. Every instinct screamed at him to be moving, searching, doing something, but he knew the value of giving the police everything they needed to work with. "I think I know who it is," Paul said. "His name is Cole. Last name Darvin, I think. He goes to Peak Fitness on Route 7. Holt's pen paused. "You know him? I've met him once. He's been training with my wife at the gym." Paul felt the weight of that statement, felt how it sounded saying it out loud. "Training with your wife," Holt repeated, his eyes sharpening. "What's their relationship?" "She says they're just gym friends." Paul heard the skepticism in his own voice. "I think it's more than that." Holt exchanged a glance with Bennett. "What makes you think that?" Paul pulled out his phone and scrolled back through his text history with Cheryl. He found what he was looking for, a screenshot he'd taken 3 months ago, one he'd almost deleted a dozen times. He handed the phone to Holt. The detective read the message thread. It was from Cheryl's phone, a conversation Paul had seen when her screen lit up on the bathroom counter one morning. The messages weren't explicit, but they were familiar. Inside jokes, winking emojis, arrangements to meet up that didn't include Paul. "You confront her about this?" Holt asked. "Yes." Paul took the phone back. "She said I was being paranoid. Said Cole was helping her train for a 5K she wanted to run. Said the messages were taken out of context. Did you believe her?" Paul looked Holt straight in the eye. "No." The admission hung in the air. Holt nodded slowly and made another note. "We're going to need to speak with your wife," Holt said. "And we need to find this Cole Darvin immediately." "Bennett, run his name. Peak Fitness on Route 7. Call them. Get his membership information. Get an address." Bennett stepped out of the office, already on his radio. Holt turned back to Paul. "I need you to think carefully. Has Scott ever mentioned this man? Has your wife ever taken Scott to meet him, to your knowledge?" Paul's mind raced backward through the past 6 months. How many times had Cheryl said she was taking Scott to the park while Paul worked late? How many times had she picked Scott up early from preschool for a special outing that she never quite detailed? How many times had Scott mentioned things, new places, new games, new stories, that neither Paul nor Cheryl had taught him? "I don't know," Paul said, and the words tasted bitter. I thought she was just spending time with him. I didn't question it." "Don't blame yourself for trusting your wife," Holt said, but there was something in his tone that suggested he'd seen this story before. The door opened and Cheryl rushed in, her dark hair pulled back in a ponytail, her gym clothes still on under her jacket. Her eyes were red, makeup smudged. She looked at Paul first, then at Detective Holt. "Where's Scott?" she demanded. "Where's my son?" "Mrs. Rourke." Holt stood and extended his hand. "I'm Detective Holt. We're working on locating your son right now. I need to ask you some questions." "Questions? You should be out looking for him." Cheryl's voice rose, shrill and sharp. Paul watched her carefully, watched the way her eyes darted around the room, the way her hands trembled. Real panic, certainly, but something else too. Something that looked like guilt. "Do you know anyone named Cole Darvin?" Holt asked. Cheryl's face went pale. She froze, her mouth opening slightly, and Paul saw the truth written across her features as clearly as words on a page. He's a friend. From the gym." "Why?" "Because we believe he's the man who picked up your son from preschool this afternoon." Cheryl's knees seemed to buckle. She grabbed the edge of the desk for support. No, he wouldn't. Why would he?" "So you do know him well enough to have an opinion on what he would or wouldn't do," Holt said, his voice hardening slightly. Paul stood. He crossed the small space and stood directly in front of his wife. Cheryl looked up at him, tears streaming down her face now, and he felt nothing but a cold, analytical detachment. "Tell them the truth," Paul said quietly. "I don't." "Tell them the truth, Cheryl." She broke. Not dramatically, not with any grand confession, but in small increments, her shoulders sagging, her breath catching, her eyes dropping to the floor. We've been seeing each other," she whispered. "But he wouldn't hurt Scott. He loves Scott. He would never. He took our son without permission." Paul interrupted, his voice still quiet but carrying an edge like broken glass. "A man you've been sleeping with took our son, and you don't think that's a problem?" Cheryl flinched. Holt stepped between them, his hand raised. "Mrs. Rourke, I need you to sit down and tell me everything about your relationship with Cole Darvin. And I need to know if you have any idea where he might have taken Scott." Bennett returned, his phone pressed to his ear. He nodded to Holt. "Got an address. Sending units now." Paul's phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out and saw a text from an unknown number. "Scott is safe. Just wanted to spend some time with him. Didn't mean to scare anyone. Dropping him at Riverside Park in 10 minutes. Paul's vision tunneled. He showed the phone to Holt, who immediately barked orders into his radio. Within seconds, the office exploded into coordinated movement. Officers rushing out, car doors slamming, sirens wailing back to life. "Stay here," Holt told Paul and Cheryl. "We'll bring your son back." But Paul was already moving toward the door. "That's my son. I'm going." Holt didn't argue. They ran to the parking lot together, and Paul followed the police cruiser in his truck, his hands gripping the steering wheel hard enough to make his knuckles ache. The drive to Riverside Park took 8 minutes that felt like 8 hours. When they arrived, Paul saw Cole, standing near the playground, Scott's small hand in his. The boy was eating an ice cream cone, completely oblivious to the terror he'd caused. For police cars surrounded them, officers emerging with their hands near their weapons. Paul was out of his truck before it fully stopped. He sprinted across the grass, his boots pounding against the ground, and Cole saw him coming. The man raised his hands immediately, backing away from Scott, his face showing sudden understanding of how badly he'd miscalculated. "I didn't mean," Cole started. Paul didn't let him finish. He scooped Scott up in his arms, felt his son's small body solid and real and safe, and turned his back on Cole without another word. Scott's ice cream smeared against Paul's shirt, and the boy looked confused by all the police cars and the commotion. "Daddy, you're squishing me," Scott protested, but Paul couldn't make himself loosen his grip. "I know, buddy," Paul said into Scott's hair. "I know. I'm sorry." Behind him, he heard Cole being read his rights, heard the clink of handcuffs, heard Cheryl arrive and start crying and apologizing and begging. Paul carried Scott to his truck, buckled him into his car seat, and just stood there for a moment with his hand on his son's knee. "Are you okay?" Paul asked, his voice rough. "Yeah, Mr. Cole got me ice cream, but I wasn't supposed to leave without you." Scott looked worried now, like he'd broken a rule. "Am I in trouble?" "No," Paul said. "You're not in trouble. Not even a little bit." He closed the door gently and leaned against the truck, his legs suddenly weak. Detective Holt approached, his expression grim. "Your son's safe?" Holt said. "That's what matters most. But Mr. Rourke, we need to have a serious conversation about what happens next." Paul nodded. He could still hear Cheryl's voice in the distance, still see Cole's face before the officers put him in the cruiser. Confused, scared, like he genuinely hadn't understood the magnitude of what he'd done. "My wife," Paul said. She knew. She let him around Scott before. Holt's expression confirmed what Paul already suspected. "We'll be investigating that thoroughly." Paul looked through the truck window at his son, who had pulled a toy car from his backpack and was rolling it along the edge of his car seat, making engine noises. Scott was safe, but everything else, his marriage, his trust, his understanding of the past year, lay shattered at his feet. "I need to take him home," Paul said. "We'll need statements from both of you. Tomorrow morning, if that works." Paul agreed, then got in his truck and drove away from Riverside Park. Scott chattered in the back seat about his day, about the new friend he'd made at snack time, about a story Ms. Laurel had read about dinosaurs. He'd already forgotten the strangeness of being picked up by Mr. Cole, the ice cream adventure, an unremarkable detour in his 4-year-old world. But Paul remembered every second, every detail, every implication. And as he turned onto their street, their house coming into view with its neat lawn and painted shutters and the flower boxes Cheryl had insisted on installing last spring, Paul made a decision that felt as final as closing a door on a room he'd never enter again. This marriage was over. He just had to figure out how to dismantle it without destroying his son in the process. That night, after Paul had given Scott dinner and a bath and read him 3 bedtime stories, after his son finally drifted off to sleep clutching his stuffed elephant, Paul sat alone in the living room and waited for Cheryl to come home. She arrived after 10, her face swollen from crying. She stood in the doorway and looked at him like she expected something. Forgiveness, maybe, or at least an opening for explanation. Paul didn't give her either. "We'll talk tomorrow," he said, "after I give my statement to the police." Cheryl wrapped her arms around herself. "Paul, tomorrow," he repeated. She nodded and disappeared down the hallway toward their bedroom. Paul stayed on the couch, listening to the house settle around him, and knew with absolute certainty that he would never let anyone threaten his son's safety again, not even his son's mother. Act in 1. The police station smelled like burnt coffee and industrial cleaner. Paul sat in an interview room with pale blue walls and a table scarred with years of use. Detective Holt sat across from him, a folder open between them, a recording device blinking red in the corner. "Walk me through your relationship with your wife," Holt said. "How long have you been married?" 6 years. Paul's hands rested flat on the table, steady. "We met when I was 28. She was working a marketing firm in Denver, came to Evergreen Hollow to visit her college roommate. We met at a bar downtown. Things were good at first." Yes. Paul remembered those early years, the way Cheryl had laughed easily, the spontaneous weekend trips they'd taken, the excitement of finding out she was pregnant with Scott. They were good for a while. When did that change? Paul considered the question. When had the shift happened? Not all at once. More like erosion, slow and steady until one day he looked at their marriage and barely recognized it. About a year and a half ago, Paul said, right after Scott turned 3, she started working longer hours, started going to the gym more. We stopped talking about anything except logistics, who was picking Scott up, what bills needed to be paid, when we needed to grocery shop. "You ever consider marriage counseling?" I suggested it twice. She said we didn't need it, that every marriage goes through rough patches. Paul's jaw tightened. I believed her. Thought if I just gave her space, if I focused on being a good father and keeping the shop running, things would balance out. Holt made a note. "When did you first become aware of Cole Darvin?" 6 months ago. I stopped by the gym to give Cheryl her house keys. She'd left them at home and needed them to pick up Scott from my sister's place. I saw them together by the weights. He was standing close, touching her arm while he explained something about form. She was smiling. "Did that concern you?" "Yes," Paul said bluntly. But when I asked about him later, she acted like I was being ridiculous. Said he was just a trainer at the gym who offered free advice sometimes. Made me feel like I was being jealous and controlling for even bringing it up. Classic gaslighting, Holt observed. Paul had heard that term before, but hadn't applied it to his own life until now. "Yeah, I guess it was. Tell me about the text messages you mentioned yesterday." Paul pulled out his phone and navigated to the screenshots folder. He'd documented more than he'd shown Holt at the preschool. Pieces of evidence he'd been collecting without really admitting to himself what they meant. He laid the phone on the table, and Holt scrolled through the images. Text conversations between Cheryl and someone saving her phone as Kelly from yoga. Except Paul had seen the real Kelly from yoga at the grocery store, and she wasn't the person Cheryl was texting about meeting up for drinks. These messages, Holt said, pointing to one thread. She says here, "Can't wait to see you tomorrow. Telling P I have a late meeting." P meaning you. Yes. And you never confronted her about this? Paul felt the shame of that admission like a weight in his chest. "I did. Once. 3 months ago. I saw these messages and I asked her directly if she was having an affair. She cried. Said I was being paranoid, that I was letting work stress make me suspicious of innocent friendships. She turned it around on me. Said I was the one who'd been distant, who never asked about her day, who chose to shop over our family. Did you believe that?" Part of me wondered if she was right. I do work a lot. I'm not great at emotional conversations. I thought maybe I was manufacturing problems where there weren't any. Paul looked down at his hands. I wanted to believe her because the alternative was worse. Holt leaned back in his chair. "Mr. Rourke, I need to ask you some difficult questions now. Questions about yesterday and what your wife might have known about Cole's intentions. Go ahead. Did your wife ever mention Cole wanting to be more involved in Scott's life?" Paul thought back through recent conversations, through the fragments of information Cheryl had let slip. She said once that Cole was good with kids. that he'd mentioned wanting to be a father someday. I thought she was just making conversation. Did Scott ever talk about Cole? That question landed harder. Paul forced himself to trace through his memories of bedtime conversations, car rides, dinner table chatter. Had Scott mentioned someone new? Someone beyond the usual cast of preschool teachers and classmates? He talked about going to the park more often, Paul said slowly. About a friend of Mommy's who pushed him on the swings. About playing catch with someone who threw better than I did. The implications assembled themselves like pieces of a machine Paul hadn't wanted to build. I thought he was talking about another parent, another kid's father, but he wasn't. No. Holt pulled a document from his folder and slid it across the table. We pulled the preschool's records. 3 times in the past 2 months, your wife signed Scott out early. Each time, she listed a reason: doctor's appointment, family event, early pickup for a trip. But according to Scott's pediatrician, he didn't have any appointments. And according to you, there were no family events. Paul stared at the sign-out sheet, at Cheryl's signature repeated 3 times. His hands curled into fists on the table. Where was she taking him? Paul asked, though he already knew the answer. We're working on establishing that. But based on Cole's statement and your wife's preliminary interview, it appears she was bringing Scott to meet with Cole. Sometimes at the park. Once at Cole's apartment. The room felt too small suddenly, the air too thick. Paul forced himself to breathe evenly, to stay present. Rage wouldn't help. Rage wouldn't change what had already happened. She brought my son to this man's apartment. Paul said, each word deliberate. Yes. Did she tell Cole he could pick Scott up from preschool? Holt hesitated, and that hesitation told Paul everything. Cole claims your wife told him it would be fine, that you were working late and she was stuck in a meeting, and Scott knew him well enough that it wouldn't be a problem. He says he didn't realize the preschool hadn't been informed. Did my wife tell the preschool? No, which is why Ms. Laurel accepted his story about being your brother. The school had no authorization for Cole Darvin in any form. Paul processed this information methodically, sorting it into categories in his mind. Cheryl had lied to the preschool. She'd lied to him. She'd put Scott in the care of a man Paul didn't know and hadn't approved of. She'd constructed an entire separate reality behind his back. What happens now? Paul asked. Cole Darvin has been charged with custodial interference and reckless endangerment. He's cooperating fully, claiming he didn't understand the legal implications of picking up a child without proper authorization. His lawyer is arguing it was a misunderstanding, not a kidnapping attempt. What about Cheryl? Holt's expression hardened. Your wife is being investigated for child endangerment, custodial interference, and filing a false report with the preschool. The district attorney will decide whether to press charges. Paul absorbed this. His wife, Scott's mother, facing potential criminal charges. Part of him felt a grim satisfaction. Another part, a smaller part he tried to ignore, felt something like grief. I want full custody, Paul said. That's a family court matter, not criminal. But Mr. Rourke, between you and me, after what happened yesterday, after what we're finding in this investigation, you have a very strong case. The door opened, and another officer poked his head in. Detective, Mrs. Rourke is here. She's asking to speak with her husband. Paul stood. I don't want to talk to her yet. That's your right, Holt said. But you'll need to speak with her eventually. You still share a home, and you share a son. Not for long. Paul left the interview room and walked through the station toward the exit. He passed by a hallway and saw Cheryl sitting on a bench outside another interview room, her face in her hands. She looked up when she heard his footsteps, and their eyes met. She started to stand, started to move toward him. Paul turned away and walked out into the morning sunlight. He drove straight to his lawyer's office. Jim Brennan had handled the legal work for Paul's auto shop for years. Contracts, liability issues, the occasional dispute with suppliers. He was a practical man in his 60s who wore Western shirts and kept a photo of his fishing boat on his desk. Paul, Jim said when his secretary showed Paul into the office. I heard about what happened. How's Scott? He's fine. He's with my sister today. Paul sat down across from Jim's desk, his back straight, his hands clasped. I need to file for divorce. Jim's bushy eyebrows rose slightly, but he simply pulled out a legal pad and pen. Tell me everything. Paul laid out the facts in order. The affair. the unauthorized pickups, the lie to the preschool, the police investigation. He spoke without emotion, presenting each piece of evidence like parts laid out for an engine repair. When he finished, Jim set down his pen and leaned back in his chair. You understand that if we pursue this, if we go after full custody, it's going to get ugly, Jim said. Your wife will fight back. She'll claim you work too much, that you're trying to punish her, that Scott needs his mother. Scott needs a parent who doesn't put him in danger, Paul replied. That's me. Jim nodded slowly. All right, here's what we're going to do. They spent the next 2 hours going through the process, filing for separation, documenting everything, preparing for custody mediation, getting ahead of whatever story Cheryl might try to tell. Jim took notes in his careful handwriting, occasionally asking clarifying questions, building the framework of Paul's case. One more thing, Jim said as Paul stood to leave. I need you to stay clean through all this. Don't lose your temper. Don't say anything to your wife that could be used against you. Don't do anything that makes you look unstable or vindictive. You're the reasonable one here. You need to stay that way. I will, Paul said. He meant it. Rage was easy. Rage was tempting. But rage made you sloppy, and Paul couldn't afford to be sloppy. Not when his son's future was at stake. Paul picked Scott up from his sister Rachel's house that afternoon. She lived on the other side of Evergreen Hollow in a small ranch house with her husband and 2 daughters. Scott was in the backyard playing with his cousins when Paul arrived, his laughter carrying through the open kitchen window. Coffee, Rachel offered. Yeah, thanks. They sat at her kitchen table, and Rachel poured 2 mugs from the pot she'd kept warm. She was 3 years younger than Paul, taught 4th grade at the elementary school, had always been the one in the family who knew how to ask the right questions. How are you holding up? She asked. I'm fine. Paul. He looked at his sister and saw the concern in her eyes, the way she was studying his face like she could read all the things he wasn't saying. I'm going to divorce her, Paul said. I'm filing for full custody. Rachel nodded, unsurprised. Good. You think so? I think Cheryl put Scott at risk. I think she lied to you for months. I think she's been planning a life that doesn't include you. Rachel wrapped both hands around her coffee mug. And I think you deserve better. You both do. Paul felt some of the tension in his shoulders ease. He hadn't realized how much he needed someone to tell him he wasn't overreacting, that his anger was justified, that leaving was the right choice. It's going to be hard on Scott, Paul said. Harder than growing up watching his parents barely tolerate each other. Rachel shook her head. Kids aren't stupid, Paul. They know when something's wrong. Through the window, Paul watched Scott climb the ladder to Rachel's daughter's tree house, his small face bright with concentration. He was so young, too young to understand why his family was breaking apart, why his mother had done what she did. But he was also young enough to adapt, young enough that this could become his normal instead of his trauma. I need to tell him something, Paul said, about why things are changing. But I don't know what to say. Keep it simple, age-appropriate. Focus on what stays the same. You love him. You'll always be there for him. His life is still safe and stable. And his mother? Rachel's expression hardened slightly. That's Cheryl's mess to clean up. You just focus on being the parent Scott can count on. Paul finished his coffee and went outside to collect his son. Scott hugged his cousins goodbye and took Paul's hand as they walked to the truck. Did you have fun? Paul asked. Yeah, we built a fort and played spies, and Aunt Rachel made grilled cheese with the crust cut off. Scott swung their joined hands as they walked. Can we come back tomorrow? Maybe this weekend, Paul said. He buckled Scott into his car seat and started the drive home. Except home didn't feel like home anymore. Home was where Cheryl would be, where they'd have to exist in the same space while pretending everything wasn't collapsing around them. Paul made a decision. Instead of turning toward their house, he drove to the extended stay hotel near the highway. He rented a 2-room suite on the 2nd floor, carried their bags up from the truck, and set Scott up with his toys while he called Rachel back. Can you pick up some clothes from the house for us? Paul asked. I don't want to go back there yet. Of course. I'll go right now. Paul sat on the edge of the hotel bed and looked around the generic room. Bland art on the walls, a TV mounted above the dresser, curtains that blocked out most of the parking lot lights. It wasn't much, but it was space away from Cheryl, space to think and plan and breathe. Scott appeared in the doorway, clutching his stuffed elephant. Why are we here, Daddy? We're going to stay here for a little while, Paul said. Like an adventure. An adventure? Scott's eyes lit up. Like camping. Sort of like camping, but with better beds. Scott seemed satisfied with that explanation and ran back to the other room to arrange his toys. Paul heard him narrating some game to himself, his voice high and innocent, and felt his resolve harden into something unbreakable. He would protect his son, from anyone, even from the boy's own mother, if necessary. Late that evening, after Scott had fallen asleep in the hotel room's second bed, Paul's phone buzzed with a text from Cheryl. Where are you? Why aren't you home? Paul stared at the message for a long moment, then typed out a response. At a hotel. Don't call. Don't text. Talk through lawyers. Her response came immediately. Paul, please. We need to talk about this. I can explain everything. But Paul had already put the phone face down on the nightstand. He didn't want her explanations. He didn't want her apologies. He wanted distance and clarity and a legal framework that would ensure Scott's safety. Over the next week, the investigation into Cheryl's actions progressed. Detective Holt called Paul with updates, witness statement from other parents at the preschool, record from Cheryl's phone showing extensive communication with Cole, evidence that she'd been planning to leave Paul and start a new life with Cole and Scott. Each new piece of information confirmed what Paul already knew. His wife hadn't just made one mistake. She'd made a series of calculated decisions that put their son at risk and destroyed any remaining trust between them. The custody mediation was scheduled for 2 weeks out. In the meantime, Paul established a temporary routine. He and Scott stayed at the hotel. Paul's sister helped with childcare when Paul had to work, and Cheryl was allowed supervised visits at a family services center downtown. Paul refused to speak to her directly. Everything went through their lawyers or through the mediator. Jim Brennan reported that Cheryl was trying to paint herself as the victim, a neglected wife, a mother who'd made a mistake but who loved her son, a woman who deserved a second chance. She's going to cry in mediation, Jim warned. She's going to try to make you look cold and unforgiving. I'm unforgiving, Paul said. She endangered our son. I know. Just remember that we need to present you as the stable, reasonable parent. Don't lose your cool, no matter what she says. The night before mediation, Paul sat in the hotel room and wrote out everything he wanted to say. Not for the mediator. He let Jim do most of the talking there, but for himself. He needed to organize his thoughts, to understand exactly what he was fighting for and why. Scott deserves a home where he feels safe. Scott deserves parents who prioritize his well-being over their own desires. Scott deserves honesty, stability, and protection. Paul looked at what he'd written and realized that everything came back to one central truth. He would do anything for his son. Cheryl had proven she wouldn't. That was the difference between them, and that was why Paul would win. The mediation took place in a conference room at the Family Law Center, a bland space with beige walls and a long table. Cheryl arrived with her lawyer, a sharp-dressed woman named Ms. Park who specialized in defending mothers in custody cases. Cheryl wore a conservative dress and minimal makeup, her hair pulled back, clearly trying to project an image of maternal competence. Paul sat across from them with Jim at his side. He wore a clean button-down shirt and jeans, his hands folded calmly on the table. He didn't look at Cheryl when she entered. He didn't acknowledge her at all. The mediator, an older woman named Mrs. Davidson, reviewed the case file and then looked up at both parties. We're here to determine a custody arrangement that serves the best interests of Scott Rourke, age 4, she said. I've reviewed the police reports, the statements from Little Pines Preschool, and the preliminary findings from Child Protective Services. This is an unusual case, given the circumstances of how it came to mediation. Ms. Park leaned forward. Mrs. Rourke wants to make clear that she deeply regrets the events that led to this situation. She made an error in judgment, but she has always acted out of love for her son. She's seeking joint custody with a shared parenting plan. Jim didn't wait for Mrs. Davidson to respond. Mr. Rourke is seeking full physical and legal custody, with supervised visitation for Mrs. Rourke until such time as she can demonstrate that she won't put Scott at risk again. Cheryl's composure cracked immediately. I would never hurt Scott. I love him. I'm his mother. You allowed a man your husband didn't know to take your son without authorization, Jim said calmly. You lied to the preschool about your relationship with that man. You forged documents to allow unauthorized individuals to pick up your child. These aren't the actions of someone who prioritizes their child's safety. I didn't forge anything. Cheryl's voice rose. And Cole wasn't a stranger. Scott knew him. Scott liked him. Scott is 4 years old, Paul said, speaking for the first time. His voice was quiet but carried across the table like a blade. He doesn't get to decide which adults are safe. That's our job. And you failed. Cheryl turned to him, tears streaming down her face. Paul, please. I know I made mistakes, but don't take my son away from me. I can be better. I can fix this. Paul looked at her directly then, and his expression was carved from stone. You didn't make a mistake. You made a series of choices. You chose to lie. You chose to put Scott at risk. You chose your affair over our family. I was lonely, Cheryl shouted. You were never home. You never talked to me. You cared more about your shop than about your wife. I was working to support our family, Paul replied evenly. And even if I wasn't perfect, even if our marriage had problems, that didn't give you the right to endanger our son. Mrs. Davidson held up a hand. Let's take a moment. I want to hear from both of you about what you believe is best for Scott moving forward. Ms. Park launched into a prepared speech about the importance of maternal bonds, about research showing children need both parents, about Cheryl's willingness to complete parenting classes and therapy. She painted a picture of a contrite mother who'd learned from her mistakes and deserved to maintain her relationship with her son. When she finished, Jim presented Paul's case. He laid out the evidence methodically, the police reports, the statements from the preschool, the documentation of Cheryl's deception. He presented Paul as the stable parent, the one who'd provided consistent care, the one who'd prioritized Scott's needs above his own feelings. Mr. Rourke isn't asking for Cheryl to be removed from Scott's life entirely, Jim said. He's asking for safeguards. Supervised visitation until trust can be rebuilt. Primary physical custody, so Scott has a stable home base. Legal custody, so decisions about Scott's welfare are made by the parent who's demonstrated sound judgment. Mrs. Davidson made notes and asked clarifying questions. The mediation stretched on for 3 hours, with breaks and private consultations. Cheryl cried multiple times. Paul remained calm, answering every question directly and without embellishment. Finally, Mrs. Davidson closed her folder and looked at both parties. Based on the evidence presented and the circumstances of this case, I'm recommending that Paul Rourke be granted primary physical and legal custody of Scott Rourke. Cheryl Rourke will have supervised visitation 2 days per week, to be increased to unsupervised visitation after completion of court-mandated parenting classes and a psychological evaluation. Cheryl sobbed openly. Ms. Park put a hand on her client's shoulder but didn't argue with the decision. She knew how damning the evidence was. Jim nodded, satisfied. Thank you, Mrs. Davidson. Paul felt nothing but a quiet sense of closure. He protected his son. That was all that mattered. As they filed out of the mediation room, Cheryl grabbed Paul's arm. Paul, wait. Please. He stopped, looked down at her hand on his sleeve, then at her face. Don't do this, she whispered. Don't take him away from me. I know I messed up, but I'm still his mother. He needs me. Paul gently removed her hand from his arm. He needs a mother he can trust. Right now, that's not you. He walked away while she stood in the hallway, her lawyer trying to console her, her tears falling on the industrial carpet. Outside, the Colorado sun felt bright and clear. Paul stood in the parking lot for a moment, breathing in the cool air, feeling lighter than he had in weeks. You did good in there, Jim said, coming up beside him. Never lost your composure, never got defensive. The judge is going to uphold this recommendation when it goes to court. When will that be? Probably 30 days for the formal hearing. But this mediation recommendation will hold until then. You could take Scott home today. Home. Paul still needed to figure out what that meant. The house he'd shared with Cheryl didn't feel like home anymore. The hotel was temporary. He needed to find a place that was just his and Scott's, where they could build something new. Thanks, Jim, Paul said, shaking his lawyer's hand. Stay strong. This isn't over yet, but you're winning. Paul drove back to the hotel, picked up Scott from Rachel's, and took his son out for dinner at the burger place downtown that Scott loved. They sat in a booth by the window, and Paul watched his son dip French fries in ketchup and talk about the drawing he'd made that day at Rachel's house. "Daddy, are we going to go back to our house?" Scott asked, his face smeared with ketchup. Eventually, Paul said, "We might find a new house, though, just for you and me. Would you like that?" Scott considered this seriously. "Can I have my own room?" "Yes, you can have your own room. With space for all my trucks. With space for all your trucks." Scott grinned and went back to his fries, satisfied. Later that night, after Scott had fallen asleep, Paul sat on the hotel balcony and called Rachel. "How did it go?" she asked. "I got primary custody. She gets supervised visits." "Thank God." Rachel's relief was palpable through the phone. "How do you feel?" Paul thought about that question. How do you feel? Not triumphant, not vindictive, just settled, like a problem had been solved, like a broken part had been replaced with something that worked. "Like I can breathe again," he said. 3 months later, Paul stood in the driveway of his new house, a modest 3-bedroom ranch on the east side of Evergreen Hollow, with a fenced backyard and a garage big enough for his tools. It wasn't fancy, but it was theirs. His and Scott's. The moving truck had left an hour ago, and now cardboard boxes filled every room. Scott ran through the empty spaces, his footsteps echoing, claiming his territory with the unself-conscious joy of a child who didn't yet understand how significant this moment was. "Daddy, come see my room," Scott called from down the hall. Paul walked through the house, taking in the fresh paint smell, the sunlight coming through windows that didn't carry the weight of failed conversations and bitter silences. This house had no history, no ghosts, just possibility. Scott's room faced the backyard, with 2 large windows and enough space for his bed, his toy boxes, and the bookshelf Paul had already assembled. Scott stood in the center of the empty room, arms spread wide. "It's so big," he said. "You think so?" "Yeah, and I can see the whole yard from here." Scott pressed his face against the window. "Can we get a swing set?" "We can," Paul agreed. They spent the afternoon unpacking, Scott's room first, then the kitchen, then Paul's room. Rachel stopped by with her daughters and a casserole for dinner. She walked through the house with Paul while the kids played in the backyard. "It's perfect," she said. "It feels like you." "Yeah." Paul looked around at the empty walls, the bare bones of what would become their home. "I don't even know what that means anymore." "It means calm, steady, safe." Rachel squeezed his arm. "It means you're building something that's actually worth building." Over the following weeks, Paul settled into a new rhythm. He dropped Scott off at preschool every morning, put in his hours at the shop, picked Scott up every afternoon. They had dinner together every night at the kitchen table Paul had bought from a furniture store in town. They read books before bed. They went to the park on weekends. Simple things, normal things, things that felt revolutionary after the chaos of the past few months. Paul also expanded the shop, hiring another mechanic to help handle the increased workload. Business had been good. Word had spread about what happened with Scott, and the community had rallied around Paul in subtle ways. More customers, more referrals, more support. Tommy, his lead mechanic, cornered him one afternoon while they were both working on a transmission job. "You seem different," Tommy said, his hands black with grease. "Lighter." "Yeah," Paul said. "I feel lighter." "Good. You were carrying too much for a while there." Paul thought about that observation. He had been carrying too much, the weight of a failing marriage, the burden of trying to fix something that didn't want to be fixed, the constant anxiety of wondering what Cheryl was really doing when she said she was at work or the gym. Now he carried less, just himself and Scott, just the basics of building a good life. Cheryl saw Scott twice a week at the Family Services Center, always with a supervisor present. Paul coordinated the logistics through their lawyers and through the court-appointed mediator. He never spoke to her directly. He didn't trust himself to remain civil, and more importantly, he didn't see the point. The court had ordered her to complete parenting classes, attend individual therapy, and maintain stable employment before her visitation could be unsupervised. According to Jim, she was complying with all requirements, but slowly. "She's dragging her feet," Jim reported during one of their check-in calls. Going to the minimum number of classes, showing up late to appointments. The therapist notes that she's resistant to accepting responsibility for her actions. Will that affect the final custody ruling? Paul asked. It won't help her case. The judge will see the pattern. Someone who's doing the bare minimum to check boxes rather than someone who's genuinely committed to change. The final custody hearing was scheduled for early December. Until then, the temporary arrangement held. Paul heard through mutual friends that Cheryl and Cole had broken up shortly after the mediation. Apparently, Cole had panicked when he understood the legal consequences of his actions, had distanced himself from Cheryl immediately, had even moved to a different city to escape the gossip and judgment. Paul felt nothing about this information. Not satisfaction, not vindication. Just a vague sense that karma had its own way of working. One Saturday in late October, Paul took Scott to the recreation center for his swim lesson. Scott had become obsessed with swimming after Rachel took him to the community pool over the summer, and Paul had signed him up for lessons. He sat in the observation area and watched his son splash around with the instructor, his small arms paddling with determined concentration. Another parent sat down next to him, a woman Paul recognized from the preschool pickups, though he'd never spoken to her before. "Your son's getting good," she said, nodding toward the pool. "Thanks. He loves the water." "I'm Emily," she said, extending her hand. "My daughter Anna is in the class." Paul shook her hand. "Paul." They watched the lesson in comfortable silence for a few minutes, and Paul felt none of the awkwardness he might have expected. Just two parents sitting together, watching their kids, sharing space without demands or expectations. "I heard about what happened with your wife," Emily said quietly. "I'm sorry you had to go through that." Paul glanced at her, prepared to deflect or change the subject, but something in her expression stopped him. She wasn't being nosy. She was offering genuine sympathy. "Thank you," he said. "My ex-husband had an affair too," Emily continued. "Left me for a woman he worked with. It's brutal." "Yeah," Paul agreed. "It is. But you know what I learned?" Emily smiled slightly. "Sometimes the best thing that happens to you is the thing you thought would destroy you. I'm happier now than I ever was in that marriage. I just didn't know it could be different." Paul considered her words. Was he happier? Maybe not happy exactly. That felt too simple. But he was more himself, more present, more connected to what actually mattered. "Yeah," he said again. "I think I'm figuring that out." The swim lesson ended, and Scott ran over with a towel wrapped around his shoulders, shivering and grinning. "Did you see me? Did you see my backstroke?" "I saw," Paul said, ruffling his son's wet hair. "You were great." As they walked to the truck, Scott chattering about underwater somersaults and diving lessons, Paul felt something unfamiliar settle in his chest. It took him a moment to identify it. Peace. The final custody hearing took place on a gray December morning. Fresh snow covered Evergreen Hollow, and the courthouse steps were slick with ice. Paul arrived early with Jim, both of them carrying briefcases full of documentation, evidence of Paul's stable home, his involvement in Scott's daily life, his adherence to every court requirement. Cheryl arrived with Ms. Park, looking thinner than Paul remembered. She glanced at him across the courthouse lobby, and he saw something in her eyes that might have been regret. But Paul looked away before he could identify it more clearly. They didn't speak. The hearing took place in a small courtroom before Judge Martinez, a stern woman in her 50s who'd reviewed all the evidence in advance. She listened to both lawyers present their cases, asked pointed questions about Cheryl's progress in her court-mandated programs, and reviewed the supervisor's reports from Cheryl's visits with Scott. Ms. Park argued passionately for increased visitation, citing Cheryl's completion of parenting classes and her consistent attendance at therapy. She painted a picture of a mother who'd learned from her mistakes and deserved a second chance. Jim countered with the facts. Cheryl had barely met the minimum requirements. Her therapist's notes showed resistance to accepting full responsibility. The supervised visit reports indicated she often spent more time on her phone than engaging with Scott. She'd missed 2 scheduled visits due to work conflicts. Furthermore, Jim said, standing before the judge, Mr. Rourke has provided a stable, nurturing environment for Scott. The child has thrived under his father's primary care. His preschool reports show improved behavior and emotional stability. He has a consistent routine, a supportive extended family, and a father who prioritizes his well-being above all else. Judge Martinez reviewed the documents before her, made notes, and then looked up at both parties. Mrs. Rourke, she said, I want to hear from you directly. Do you understand why the court had concerns about your judgment? Cheryl stood, her hands clasped in front of her. Yes, Your Honor. I made mistakes. I should never have allowed Cole to pick up Scott without Paul's knowledge. I should have been more honest about my relationship. I've learned from this experience, and I'm committed to being a better mother. Have you maintained contact with Mr. Darvin? No, Your Honor. That relationship ended months ago. Do you accept full responsibility for the events that led to this custody dispute? Cheryl hesitated, and Paul saw that hesitation. So did the judge. I accept that I made errors in judgment, Cheryl said carefully, though I do think some of the circumstances were. Yes or no, Mrs. Rourke? Do you accept full responsibility? Another pause. Then, quietly, yes. But the damage was done. The hesitation, the qualification, the attempt to deflect blame, it all told the judge what she needed to know. Judge Martinez delivered her ruling. Primary physical and legal custody is awarded to Paul Rourke. Cheryl Rourke will have supervised visitation every other weekend and 1 evening per week, to be reviewed in 6 months based on her continued compliance with court-ordered therapy and demonstrated commitment to co-parenting. Child support will be determined according to state guidelines. The gavel came down with a crack that echoed through the courtroom. Paul felt Jim's hand on his shoulder, heard the lawyer's quiet congratulations, but mostly he felt a door closing, a chapter ending. The legal battle was over. He'd won, not because he'd wanted to win, but because he'd been the better parent. As they left the courtroom, Cheryl stood in the hallway with Ms. Park, looking small and defeated. Paul walked past without stopping, without acknowledging her, without any sense of triumph or satisfaction. She'd made her choices. Now, she had to live with them. Outside, the snow had started falling again, soft flakes that melted on Paul's jacket as he stood on the courthouse steps. You okay? Jim asked. Yeah, Paul said. I'm good. And he was. Christmas came and went. Paul and Scott spent it with Rachel's family, opening presents around the tree, eating too much food, watching Scott play with his cousins in the snow. Simple and joyful and exactly what they both needed. Cheryl called on Christmas Day, asking if she could see Scott for a few hours. It's not your scheduled time, Paul said into the phone, his voice neutral. I know, but it's Christmas. He's my son, too, and you can see him during your scheduled visitation next weekend. Paul, please, don't do this. I'm not doing anything except following the court order. Merry Christmas, Cheryl. He hung up and didn't feel guilty. January brought new routines. Paul signed Scott up for t-ball, joined a parent committee at the preschool, started having dinner once a week with old friends he'd lost touch with during his marriage. He felt like himself again, or maybe like a better version of himself, one who'd been tested and hadn't broken. The shop continued to thrive. Paul hired a part-time bookkeeper to help with the administrative work he'd always struggled with, freeing up more time to actually work on cars and spend evenings with Scott. Money wasn't abundant, but it was steady. Enough. One evening in late January, after Scott had gone to bed, Paul sat at his kitchen table with a beer and his laptop. He'd been meaning to update his social media, something he'd neglected during the chaos of the divorce. He scrolled through old photos, deleting ones with Cheryl, keeping ones of just him and Scott. He paused on a photo from Scott's 3rd birthday, all of them together, smiling at the camera, looking like the perfect family. Paul stared at that image and tried to remember what it had felt like to believe in it. He couldn't. That version of his life felt like someone else's story now. Paul deleted the photo and closed the laptop. The next afternoon, Paul was at the shop working on a brake job when his phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. This is Cheryl. Using a friend's phone because you blocked mine. I need to talk to you. Paul stared at the message for a long moment, then set his phone face down on the workbench and went back to the brake job. 10 minutes later, the phone buzzed again. Paul, please. I know you're angry. I know I hurt you, but I need closure. I need to explain. Can we meet for coffee? Paul washed his hands in the industrial sink, dried them on a shop towel, and picked up his phone. He typed out a response. No, everything goes through lawyers. Stop contacting me. He blocked the unknown number and pocketed his phone. Tommy walked by, carrying a transmission casing. "Everything okay?" "Fine," Paul said. "Just spam." But that night, lying in bed, Paul thought about Cheryl's text. She wanted closure. She wanted to explain. She wanted something from him. Forgiveness, maybe, or understanding, or permission to feel less guilty about what she'd done. Paul had none of those things to give her. He'd already given her 6 years of his life, his trust, and his attempts to make their marriage work. She'd thrown all of it away for an affair with a man who ran at the first sign of real consequence. Now she wanted more from him. More time, more emotional energy, more of his attention. The answer was no. Paul rolled over and went to sleep. And when he woke up the next morning, he didn't think about Cheryl's text at all. February brought a cold snap that left Evergreen Hollow buried in snow. Paul and Scott built a snowman in their backyard, had snowball fights, drank hot chocolate with too many marshmallows. These were the moments Paul cataloged in his memory. The good stuff, the real stuff, the things that would matter when Scott was older and try to understand this period of his life. One Saturday morning, Paul took Scott to the hardware store for supplies to build a bookshelf for Scott's room. They were looking at wood stains when Emily from swim lessons appeared in the same aisle with her daughter Anna. "Hey," she said, smiling. "Fancy meeting you here." "We're building a bookshelf," Scott announced proudly. "That's cool. We're building a birdhouse." The kids started chattering about their respective projects, and Paul found himself in an easy conversation with Emily about construction plans and school schedules and the challenges of single parenting. "This is weird," Emily said after a few minutes, laughing. "I don't usually run into people I actually want to talk to at the hardware store." "Yeah," Paul agreed. "It's nice. Hey, my parents are taking Anna this afternoon, so I can run errands. If you want help with that bookshelf, I'm pretty handy with a drill." Paul considered the offer. It had been a long time since he'd let anyone into his space, into his routine with Scott. But Emily felt safe somehow, uncomplicated. "Sure," he said. "That would be great." They exchanged numbers, and Emily showed up that afternoon with a toolbox and a bag of cookies. She and Paul worked on the bookshelf while the kids played in Scott's room, and it felt normal. Natural, like something Paul could get used to. "So," Emily said as they sanded down the rough edges of the wood. "How are you doing?" "Really?" Paul thought about the question. "Better," he said. "A lot better than I expected." "Good. You deserve better." "So do you." Emily smiled. "Yeah, I'm figuring that out." They finished the bookshelf as the sun set, and Emily helped Paul position it in Scott's room. Scott immediately started filling it with his books, organizing them by color in a way that made no practical sense but delighted him completely. "Thanks for the help," Paul said as Emily packed up her tools. "Anytime. And hey, if you ever want to grab coffee or something, as friends, let me know. It's nice to talk to someone who gets it." "Yeah," Paul said. "I'd like that." After Emily left, Paul made dinner and sat with Scott at the kitchen table. His son talked about the birdhouse Anna was making, about swim lessons, about a story his teacher had read at preschool. Normal things. Good things. Paul looked around his kitchen, modest, clean, filled with the evidence of their life together, and felt that same sense of peace he'd been cultivating for months. He'd built this. After everything fell apart, he'd built something better. And he'd done it without compromising, without forgiving the unforgivable, without losing sight of what mattered most. In March, Cheryl requested a meeting through the mediator. Not about custody. The court order was final, but about closure. She wanted to talk, to explain herself, to have Paul understand her perspective. Jim called Paul with the request. "You don't have to agree to this," he said. "You have no legal obligation to meet with her." Paul considered it. Part of him wanted to refuse on principle, to maintain the boundary he'd established. But another part, a smaller, quieter part, was curious. Not about reconciliation or forgiveness, but about closure, about ending this chapter completely and moving forward without any lingering threads. "I'll meet with her," Paul said. "Once. In public. Time limited." Jim set it up. Thursday afternoon at a coffee shop downtown called Mountain Grounds, neutral territory where they could talk without the weight of their shared history pressing down on every word. Paul arrived 10 minutes early, got a black coffee, and chose a table by the window. The coffee shop was busy with the lunch crowd winding down, people working on laptops, having quiet conversations, living their normal lives. Cheryl arrived exactly on time. She looked different, thinner, her hair shorter, wearing clothes Paul didn't recognize. She looked like she'd been working on her appearance, trying to present the best possible version of herself. She sat down across from him, her hands wrapped around her own coffee cup. "Thank you for meeting me," she said. Paul nodded, but didn't speak. Cheryl took a breath. "I wanted to apologize. Really apologize. Not just say the words the lawyers told me to say. I know I hurt you. I know I put Scott at risk. I know I destroyed our family." Paul listened without expression. "I was unhappy," Cheryl continued. "I felt trapped in our marriage, like I was just going through the motions. You were always working, and when you were home, we barely talked. I felt invisible. And then I met Cole, and he paid attention to me. He made me feel seen. Is that supposed to make me understand?" Paul asked quietly. "No, I'm not trying to justify what I did. I'm trying to explain that I wasn't thinking about consequences. I was just trying to feel something again." Paul set his coffee down. "You know what I was doing when you were feeling invisible? I was working to support our family. I was paying the mortgage and Scott's preschool fees and the car payments. I was trying to build something stable so Scott would have a good childhood. And yeah, maybe I wasn't great at emotional conversations. Maybe I didn't notice when you needed more attention. But I never lied to you. I never put our son at risk. I never chose someone else over our family." Cheryl's eyes filled with tears. I know, Paul. That's why I wanted to talk to you. To tell you that you didn't deserve any of this. You were a good husband. You were a good father. I was the problem, not you." "I already knew that," Paul said. The bluntness of his statement seemed to strike her. She blinked, and a tear rolled down her cheek. "I miss Scott," she whispered. "I miss being his mom every day. I miss hearing about his day, tucking him in at night, being part of his life. You made choices that cost you those things. I know, but is there any chance?" Cheryl leaned forward. "Is there any chance we could work toward more time? Not just supervised visits. Maybe eventually." "No," Paul interrupted. "Not eventually. Not unless you prove over a long period of time that you can be trusted. And even then, the custody arrangement isn't changing. Scott lives with me. That's final." Cheryl pulled back like he'd slapped her. "You're never going to forgive me." "No," Paul agreed. "I'm not. That's cruel. What's cruel is what you did. I'm just protecting my son from it happening again." Cheryl stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. Several people looked over at the sound. She grabbed her purse, her hands shaking. "I thought maybe we could be civil," she said. "I thought maybe after all this time." "We are civil," Paul said. "I don't yell at you. I don't insult you. I follow the court order. But I don't forgive you, and I don't want a relationship with you beyond what's legally required for Scott's sake. That's as civil as it gets." Cheryl stared at him for a long moment, searching his face for something. Regret, maybe, or second thoughts, or any crack in his resolve. She found none. "I hope someday you understand," she said quietly. "I hope someday you know what it's like to make mistakes and need forgiveness." Paul stood and picked up his coffee cup. "I do make mistakes, but I don't make ones that hurt my son. That's the difference between us, Cheryl. That's always been the difference." He walked out of the coffee shop without looking back. Through the window, he could see Cheryl still standing by the table, crying, but Paul felt no urge to go back and comfort her. She'd made her choices. He'd made his. Now they both had to live with them. Paul drove back to the preschool, arriving just as they released the kids. Scott ran to him across the parking lot, his backpack bouncing, his face bright with the uncomplicated joy of seeing his father. "Daddy, guess what we did today?" "What did you do?" Paul asked, crouching down to Scott's eye level. "We planted seeds. Ms. Laurel said they're going to grow into flowers, but we have to water them every day and be patient." "That sounds cool. You want to plant some seeds at home, too?" Scott's eyes widened. "Can we?" "Sure. We'll stop at the store on the way home." Paul took Scott's hand and walked toward the truck. As they drove away from the preschool, Scott chattered about his day, about his friends, about the seeds they were going to plant. Paul listened and responded and felt grateful for every single moment. That night, after they planted seeds in small pots on the kitchen windowsill, after dinner and bath time and bedtime stories, Paul tucked Scott in and sat on the edge of his bed. "Daddy," Scott said sleepily, "are you happy?" The question surprised Paul. Yeah, buddy. I am. Are you? Yeah. Scott hugged his stuffed elephant closer. I like our house. I like our life. Me too, Paul said. He kissed Scott's forehead and turned off the light, leaving the door cracked open so the hallway light would keep the room from being too dark. In his own room, Paul lay in bed and thought about Cheryl's question at the coffee shop. Was he cruel for not forgiving her? For maintaining boundaries that kept her at a distance? Maybe some people would think so, but Paul didn't care what other people thought. He cared about Scott, about building a life that was healthy and stable and true. He cared about teaching his son by example that actions had consequences, that trust once broken wasn't automatically restored, that sometimes the strongest thing you could do was walk away from people who hurt you. He cared about being the kind of man who didn't compromise his values, even when it would be easier to give in. Paul closed his eyes and felt sleep approaching. Easy, natural, untroubled by guilt or doubt. He had protected his son. He had built a new life. He had done everything right, and he would never apologize for any of it.